It is early October here, and we're forecast to get a frost tonight, so I wanted to get a video made here about the basils that I grew this year. The first one here is Basil Amazel, introduced by the Proven Winners plant brand, and to the best of my knowledge, this was bred by the University of Florida. It has been widely advertised as being resistant to basil downy mildew, and this is the second year I have grown this plant, and I can attest to the fact that it is, at least in my climate, completely, totally immune to basil downy mildew. It's also completely sterile and sets no seed, although it does flower profusely, as you can see, which is fine. There's still plenty of leaves to be had here. Let me take a look at the plant. Totally clean leaves. And besides the fact that it's resistant to basil downy mildew, it seems to be resistant to basically everything. And as you can see, it's a big, healthy plant. And if you're wondering about the taste and the fragrance, this is your standard sweet Italian basil flavor as far as I can tell. I like it. I think it's good. We've had it on margarita pizzas a few times this season, and I like it. I really can't say enough about this. If you want a sweet Italian type basil, Amazel basil from Proven Winners is absolutely the best choice, and it's totally bulletproof as far as disease. Just an awesome plant. Unfortunately, basils are not frost tolerant, so this is going to be the end of the basil. Okay, the next basil I have here is Basil Perilla Wild Magic. Best of my knowledge, this basil was discovered as an open pollinated seedling in Germany near Brandenburg. This basil is definitely more of an ornamental variety. As you can see, it has absolutely tremendous flower power. It almost resembles a Perovskia or a Salvia, which certainly makes sense as basil is in the same family as those, the mint family broadly speaking. This was absolutely swarming with honeybees most of the season. I think I have a small clip of that I can put in the video here from earlier. It's too cold now and too windy for honeybees to be about. But this has been an amazing plant. It is pretty tall now, but earlier in the season it was remarkably compact, really heat and drought tolerant. And this one, although I can't find any literature confirming the downy mildew tolerance, I haven't seen any downy mildew whatsoever on this plant. Now, I will say, flavor-wise, this is a strong tasting basil. Okay, let's not mince words. As far as I can figure, this basil is just extremely reminiscent of African blue basil. This is a hybrid of camphor basil, Ocymum killimancharum, and regular basil, which is Ocymum basilicum. Camphor basil is pretty strong tasting stuff, and so is African blue basil. This is definitely a stronger tasting basil, and I haven't used this extensively by itself. I've always mixed it with the Amazel basil about 2 or 3 to 1. But I did recently try some cooking with this basil, and was really surprised to find that cooking tremendously mellows out the flavor of this, and also it holds up better to cooking. You can cook this a long while and it still retains some flavor, unlike your typical sweet Italian basils, which seem to lose all of their flavor if they're cooked heavily. And the texture actually stays better as well with cooking. So I think this is a good cooking basil, but not so much a good raw basil. It's also somewhat of a nuisance to pick because the leaves are quite tiny and it constantly flowers. So it's tough to get a lot of leaves. I mean, there's a lot of leaves to get, but it's tedious. This plant is probably better used as an ornamental and a pollinator plant. It's hard to beat this as a pollinator plant, and as just a good sturdy ornamental variety, it's really excellent. Although it does have its place in the kitchen as well, and as far as I can figure, it's just totally disease resistant. And according to the patent, it's also more cold temperature tolerant. This is a sterile variety, and it's propagated by cuttings, as was the other one. So these two varieties I'm calling Bulletproof Basils. It's Basil Wild Magic and Basil Amazel. Great varieties which I'd highly recommend to anyone who's had disease resistance issues with basil in the past. Talking about the Bulletproof Basil made me think of this plant, which is Perilla frutescens, or shiso. And yes, this can be a noxious invasive weed. I don't see it a lot here in Pennsylvania, but if you get down into the Washington, D.C. or northern Maryland area, it starts to become fairly common. Occasionally I see it roadsides around here. It's usually not these ruffled leaf forms. Usually it's more of a greenish and more of a broadleaf variety. Perilla is a very close relative of basil, and it has a somewhat basil-like fragrance, but it's also more cumin-y, I would describe it. I mean, I would describe it definitely as basil and cumin. At least that's how I perceive it. It's not a bad flavor at all. It's just not exactly like basil. And this is completely resistant to downy mildew. It's resistant to animal pests. It self-sows like crazy, and it's tolerant of a lot of adverse conditions that basil would never tolerate. Too wet, too cold, too shady. It does great. These were planted, but I have seedling ones all over the place, and it's a really great plant. Definitely used a lot in Asian cuisine, and very famously so used to color pickled articles in Japanese cuisine. But I don't know why this couldn't be used as a replacement for basil in so many recipes, because this is so much easier to grow. Perilla.